Welcome everyone. My name is Sean, and today we got to talk about this absolutely devastating report from the Federal Reserve that flies directly in the face of the Biden administration's claims that inflation is not really a thing. It's not something that exists. It's just corporate greed. The corporations are using inflation as an excuse in order to jack up prices because in reality, there is nothing in terms of economic policy that would justify these price increases. Now, of course, this is a talking point not only from President Joe Biden trying to save face going into the election, but it's also a talking point that we hear from left-wing media outlets, mainstream media outlets, and all these different other people who advocated for this spending, advocated for the lockdowns, and poo-pooed and said nonsense to everybody who pointed out that this was the most logical result of these policies. Now, we're going to get into this particular study because the Federal Reserve report is damning, and by the way, it's damning against the Federal Reserve as well, and it explains why prices are up, and spoiler alert, it's not the person charging the prices, it is the broader economic conditions. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody who signed up over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
And remind you that this show is available in podcast form. Link to that in the description. Now, first of all, I want to give credit to CNN for writing up this good article based on this piece, but you guys can actually click through and look at the original research on this from the Federal Reserve to find out that they are giving a good accounting of it. They also highlight people like Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had for years tried to turn the inflation argument into an argument on corporate greed, saying, quote, "Right now prices are up at the pump, at the supermarket, and online. At the same time, energy companies, grocery companies, and online retailers are reporting record profits," Warren said in 2021. That's not simply a pandemic issue. It's not simply some inevitable economic force of nature. It's greed, and in some cases, it's flatly illegal. Now, I've said repeatedly on this channel, and I've stuck to my guns on this, that the lowest common denominator level arguments in terms of economics are to blame the people charging the prices for the price that you pay, rather than the broader economic conditions. And since Elizabeth Warren is one of these left-wing progressives who wants to spend trillions of dollars on her favorite programs and wants to deny that there are consequences to her doing so, of course, the first thing she did was jump on this bandwagon and attack these corporations for their supposed record profits. Now, of course, one of the tricks that Elizabeth Warren does is that she counts record profits in terms of raw dollar amount value, but the thing is, if we're in an inflationary period, the raw dollar amount value of the profits that people are making could be up, but as compared to inflation could actually be down or borderline non-existent.
What about, but there's real pain. Grocery prices are up 30%, more than 30% since the beginning of the pandemic, and people are spending more on food and groceries than they have at any time really in the past 30 years. That's a real day-to-day pain that people feel.
It really is, and it's real. But the fact is that if you take a look at what the people have, they have the money to spend.
Remember, inflation got up to 9% in 2021. So if your profit margins jumped from 1 to 8% and you were reporting record dollar amounts, you would actually be at a loss when compared to that inflation. You would be way better off having a profit margin of 1%. And this is some of the things that the Federal Reserve study ended up finding out. But it actually gets much worse because remember this from Joe Biden?
It angers them and angers me that you have to spend more. For example, the whole idea of this notion that Senator Casey talked about, shrinkflation. I think it's on your
Same
program.
price for a smaller bottle of juice or something.
For example, Snickers bar, they did a thing, and it's like 20% less for the same price. That's corporate greed.
Now, in that video, I said specifically that the whole point of shrinkflation is actually to not give the illusion that you're raising prices in order to keep consumers, because these companies know that if they raise prices, they will lose market share because people would be unwilling to pay higher prices, even if they are technically doing so through shrinkflation.
And it's like 20% less for the same price. That's corporate greed. That's corporate greed. and we've got to deal with it. And that's what I'm working on.
In reality, what President Joe Biden might be too dumb to realize, or maybe he's just lying, take your pick, shrinkflation is actually one of the best ways to help the perception of inflation in the economy, because if you don't notice that things are getting slightly smaller, then you might not be as angry about this whole situation. But Biden, being the idiot that he absolutely is, calls this out as inflation being obscured, when again, his whole goal as a politician is to obscure inflationary consequences that are due in large part to spending that, by the way, did precede him with the evil orange man, but that he also engaged in and doubled down on as soon as he took office. In the recovery from the pandemic, US inflation surged to a peak of 7% in June of 2022 and has since declined to 2.7% in March of 24, as measured by the 12-month change in the personal consumption expenditures (PCE) price index. What factors have been driving the ups and downs in inflation? Production costs are traditionally considered a main contributor, particularly costs stemming from fluctuations in demand and supply of goods and services. As demand for these products rises, companies need to hire more workers and buy more intermediate good, pushing up production costs. Supply chain disruptions also push up the cost of production, and firms may pass on all or part of the increases to the consumers by raising prices. Now, under their section of potential drivers of inflation, production costs, and markups, the Federal Reserve actually blames themselves. Quote, to support households and businesses during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve lowered the federal funds rate target to essentially zero, and the federal government provided large fiscal transfers and increased unemployment benefits. These policies boosted demand for goods and services, especially as the economy recovered from the depth of the pandemic. The increase in overall demand, combined with supply chain shortage, boosted the costs of production, contributing to a surge in inflation in the post-pandemic recovery. Although labor costs account for a large part of a firm's total production costs, real labor costs were falling between early 2021 and mid-2022, such that increases in prices outpaced those in nominal wages, this making it unlikely that labor costs were driving the surge in inflation. So essentially what the Fed says is that they ended up juicing the economy back during the pandemic, which we all know, by setting the federal funds target rate to near 0%. This was done on purpose in order to stimulate demand, because it was believed that if we didn't do this, the economy would collapse. At the same time, they cite fiscal policy, where they were chucking money, giving you those checks in order for you to buy goods and services. And at the same time that all of this was happening, we actually shut down huge portions of the economy. Again, the Democrats were more in favor of this than the Republicans, and these policies were instituted across supply chains across the world. So when you add up all these different factors, what you have is too many dollars chasing too few goods. This is why prices went up. Now, what's great about this particular report is they actually address this ridiculous, absurd corporate profits argument in this particular thing as well. In fact, they say clearly, corporate profits are an imperfect measure of a firm's pricing power because several other factors can drive changes in profitability. For instance, much of the recent rise in corporate profits can be attributed to lower taxes on businesses and higher subsidies from pandemic-related government support, as well as lower net interest payments due to the monetary policy accommodation. Now, the reason I want to address this in particular is because it kind of cuts to the heart of the issue and really is a slap in the face to all these different Democratic Party representatives that are trying to use record profits as a way to obfuscate their role in the inflationary environment. So they break down the reasons why corporations probably had record profits in terms of raw dollars, and each and every one of the reasons that they gave are due to government policy. So they say a reduction in business taxes. Yes, we did have a reduction in the corporate tax under the Trump administration. That's definitely a thing. And obviously, when you tax something less, people tend to move more into those areas and produce more. So that could be a result of those corporate profits. But we also have subsidies from the government. Remember those PPP loans? They were being chucked out in every direction. Well, yeah, it is easier to increase the profits of your company when the federal government is quite literally handing you truckloads of money. But to make matters worse, we also had the dramatic interest rate cuts. And remember, the interest rate target number for the federal funds rate was near zero, or essentially zero, as described earlier in this Federal Reserve article. Well, guess what? That ended up resulting in a bunch of these different businesses being able to finance themselves without paying even the lower, milder interest rates that they were paying before that, because interest rates were already low pre-pandemic. So essentially, what we're seeing reflected in the profits is that they're getting a bunch of money from the federal government in the forms of subsidies, and they're no longer paying as high interest rates due to the support from the Federal Reserve. So when we see interest rates spike dramatically, if this profitability was all just an illusion, what you would expect to see is a bunch of these different various companies that have been around for a long time that relied heavily on borrowing cheap money go out of business. And how many stories have we covered on this channel of that very thing happening now that interest rates have gone up?
Widespread labor shortages from the pandemic and higher inflation drove up the cost of labor, eating into profits.
It was much more expensive to get these restaurant employees, and that means their cost ballooned.
And interest rates rose, which drove up the price of its leases.
Because obviously this is what was going on in the economy. But again, we're supposed to say corporate profits, price gouging, in order to obfuscate bad federal government policy and bad Federal Reserve policy. Now, the conclusion of this little Federal Reserve study ends up basically saying what I've been telling you all along, and what anybody who understood inflation, the causes of it, and the ways that governments deflect off of their responsibility for inflation already knew, that the markups that we're seeing in the economy are not unusual for any economic recovery, and in fact are perfectly in line with that. Now, there are some sectors that definitely saw price shocks, but those are largely due to other related factors. First and foremost, we had the chip shortage, we had a drop dramatically in the manufacturing of automobiles, so we see a lot of markups in the used car market, but of course, even those are coming down. Secondly, we have the issue of petroleum, oil, and obviously there's conflict going on in Russia, an oil-rich country, and a bunch of different geopolitical factors that result in the price increases there. But the fact of the matter is, the government, the Biden administration, the Democrats were trying to always sell you on a flawed premise. If it were true that inflation was not the product of production costs, and it was the product of greedy corporations being so greedy that they're all raising their prices, then what we would have seen was a company or companies break from this pact, because it would not be within their financial incentives to line up their prices with all these other companies when a bunch of these organizations rely on selling you a lot of stuff at volume, not a few things at high markup. Walmart was actually struggling to keep prices down in order to not lose their customer base when inflation was first starting, and a bunch of other companies had struggled with that as well. What we've seen is that with prices going up at Dollar Tree stores and all these Dollar Generals and whatnot, we're seeing a bunch of closures in those particular areas. We're seeing a lot of people that were shopping at more high-end grocery stores shift to Walmart. So what's actually happening is we're having a realignment in terms of where people are going because the prices are up. The idea that Dollar General would try to lose all their customers in order to make an extra $1.50 on what used to be $5 items is absurd. It's obviously inflation, and every incentive of these greedy corporations would be to undercut each other, not go into this pact where a bunch of them go out of business. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. That happens to just be the factual reality of the matter. But I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Do you want to ignore all the facts and all the evidence and all the consequences of government spending and just blame those corporations with their record profits? Or do you want to actually address what's going on? If you like this video, then show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the Federal Reserve taking a crap on Joe Biden. Till next time.